Welcome to the World and Stuff podcast. I'm Drew Petrimo, and today I'm very excited. I'm going to be joined by Sabrina Singh. She's a veteran advisor and communications expert who served at the highest levels of politics and government, from the campaigns of Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, and Michael Bloomberg, to the Department of Defense, where she served as deputy press secretary during the presidency of Joe Biden. In this episode, we'll talk about U.S. foreign policy in Ukraine and Russia, USAID, NATO, and the Middle East. We'll also talk about the future of the Democratic Party as it looks to rebuild after major losses in the 2024 election. All right, Sabrina, thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm super excited to have this conversation. I've been reading some of your bio, and you've had such an interesting career and have recently been talking about such important issues. So I kind of wanted to start, I was thinking last night, like, how should we start this conversation? And I was going back and just thinking about the people who have been president since I could vote. It was Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, Trump. So you have like the cowboy, the intellectual, the narcissist, the institutionalist, and then back to the narcissist. It just seems like there's not much continuity in American foreign policy. And I wonder, like, what you make of that. Is that a good thing, or is that problematic? Because if you were going to run a company or an institution, to be careening back and forth like this would seem crazy.
Well, I think, that's a great question. And with any president that comes in, of course, they're only him, but, his worldview shapes sort of the direction of the United States foreign policy. And of course, Congress has a say in that as well. Look, I think you've seen some consistency. I mean, for the last 80 years, the United States foreign policy towards Russia was very clear. You're seeing that upended today by Donald Trump in his second term. But I also think what shapes foreign policy and, major events, or what shapes foreign policy and then the outcomes, that leaders make are major events. 9/11 is a perfect example of a major event that shifted U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. Most recently, in 2014, Russia's brazen invasion in Crimea. And now again, 3 years ago in Ukraine. An event like October 7th, that changed, and that is going to continue to change U.S. foreign policy. So you have these events that are going to have an impact, and you are going to see leaders respond in different ways. I think what you could always count on before, President Donald Trump is there was some consistency, there was some conformity on how we would address some of these events. And you're seeing a big shift in that. Just, by some of the people that are around him to, how he conducts himself on the world stage. And you are seeing some through lines of U.S. foreign policy changing now.
So it sounds like you're saying the huge aberration here is Donald Trump. He was obviously already president before. Do you think, was his first term something completely different than we've seen throughout my lifetime, or even kind of in the post-World War II era? Or is it really just like the way he's been acting so far in the second term that's so different? I think, most people agree that there was more guardrails around Trump 1.0 than there are now. I wonder I guess maybe the question is, how different is this Trump administration than the last?
Well, I don't know that it's an aberration. I think this is what the people wanted. This is what American voters chose. They chose someone back in 2016 and again in 2024 that was committed, that ran on this platform that we are going to shake things up, and it is going to be very different from what you're used to. So how is it different from the first term till now? Yeah, I think you certainly had people, more institutionalists around the president at that time that could kind of guide him. And, I think you had more Republicans being willing to speak out against some of his policies. And what Donald Trump has done, in the 4 years that he was out of office till now, is he has made it so no one can oppose him, no one can go against him, and so this second term um, is a little different. And I mean, and frankly, I don't think we've ever seen this in our history. Is you have a billionaire coming in that's not part of the cabinet, that's not part of the government, but a private citizen coming in and making massive decisions about your life, my life, Americans' lives all around this country, all around the world, and kind of, really taking a sledgehammer to the institutions that people are it's gonna hurt. And we didn't see that in that first term. I think you're seeing that now. I think you're seeing more of a commitment to being willing to take more risks and being willing to shake it up.
Did you see Elon Musk at CPAC yesterday with his glasses on?
I sure did.
There's this assumption, I think, in society that he is just super competent because he's been a part of creating these amazing companies. But, I don't know. Just watching his performance at CPAC yesterday, I don't know if it's the ketamine or if the power has gotten to his head, but he seems like a totally different person. I remember watching a 60 Minutes episode about him when he had first started SpaceX, and there were these really emotional moments where he was talking about how there was this resistance to any efforts to have private companies do what is NASA's work, and he had been criticized by these heroic astronauts that he lionized, and how hurtful that was to him. And I remember being really moved by this company that he created and his kind of adventurism, and for him to become the person that was on the stage last night is just a weird turn of events.
It's very strange to watch. Elon Musk, regardless of what you think of him, is quite brilliant. And I think we can all, kind of acknowledge that this is a very smart man who's created different companies, thinks in a different way, that is pushing and creating different products and that consumers use. And it's not just, Americans. It's consumers like the Department of Defense. I mean, using things like SpaceX. And, to give you an example, like even like those Starlink
incredible
satellite, right.
He made
like
electric
tablets.
cars cool.
Exactly.
I mean, if any person did one of the things that he's done, at least 3 that I can think of right off the top of the head,
Right.
It would be amazing. And for him be on stage wearing these sunglasses and just talking like a frat bro is so jarring.
Well, we can pick apart the fashion choices, but I would say that, like, this is someone that is clearly innovative, clearly a smart person that's created products that we use, that, the Ukrainians are using on the battlefield. They are using these Starlink terminals to, communicate with each other in these very remote areas. What is concerning is this is a private citizen who is acknowledging he has successfully run businesses. That is just not the way how we run governments, or how government should run. And giving a private citizen access to your social security number, your bank account information, access to some of these, classified systems that the Department of Defense uses, that is concerning, and that is different, and that's a change. So to see, Republicans embracing this guy at CPAC, and, him throwing up this chainsaw as like a metaphor for slashing government, I think Democrats,
the president of Argentina. I mean, it's
right.
Just these things they wouldn't even have these things for bingo cards to put on,
Right. Well, I mean, I think we can all agree, like Democrats and Republicans, there are places we can make cuts, but like, to literally use the analogy of the chainsaw, you are going to hurt so many people in the process, and it's not going to end well.
I want to get back to Ukraine, because that strikes me as just the changeover is so jarring. Zelensky was a hero a month ago, 2 months ago, and now he's a dictator. It just seems, I mean, that must be so jarring for the rest of the world to try to figure out, because the U.S. is so powerful and plays such an important role overseas, for it to completely switch the narrative so quickly. I don't know. I just feel like that is going to do lasting damage to our relationships with our allies, not just because, the leadership won't trust us, but people living in those countries are going to kind of, some of the things I feel like that are probably being thought about America's right now are the worst visions of what people think of Americans as. And this is going to exacerbate that.
I don't think anyone saw, the president of the United States, the leader of our incredible country and a beacon of democracy, to call the president of Ukraine a dictator, who, by the way, was fairly and freely elected by the Ukrainian people. And you don't see him using that rhetoric towards Vladimir Putin, who there are, some within his own party who have called Putin a war criminal, someone that should be prosecuted for his crimes. But you don't see that language coming out of Donald Trump. So, to take in this moment of, going like where, people, of course, rallied around President Zelensky, to having our president on the world stage call him a dictator, I think that's shocking. I think that's shocking for Americans. I think that's shocking for Democrats and Republicans. And it's, of course, even more frightening for our allies and our European allies that, are very close to Russia. Of course, people are very concerned about the rhetoric coming out of Donald Trump.
I remember in 2009 when there was this Russian reset with Hillary Clinton. 2014, Obama was dragged by Republicans for not arming sufficiently the Ukrainians. Yeah, I guess this kind of goes along with the theme we've been talking about already, but it's such a turnabout, even for Republicans, to now kind of, maybe it's the silence that is so striking, but when Donald Trump says these things about what was formerly was just an ally, and kind of cozying up to what to many Republicans has been the arch nemesis in U.S. foreign policy, it's such a jarring change again. Yeah.
Well, you're seeing a complete undoing, thread by thread, of American foreign policy that has stood for 80 years. And it is scary. This administration right now is really playing into Putin's hands. I mean, the idea that Ukraine can even hold elections right now is a talking point that the Kremlin pushes. They keep pushing that, Zelensky hasn't had an election since the war started. Well, obviously, you're occupying 20% of the country. How do you have free and fair elections in the eastern part of Ukraine and the Donbass? How do you do that in Crimea? And you're seeing the president of the United States, using the same talking points that we've seen from the Kremlin. And I think there are some people in Congress, some Republicans, that are concerned by that. And I can only imagine that there are people within his administration concerned by that. But again, it's coming from the president. So we have to take seriously what he also said.
It also strikes me like, if you look at it from Putin's point of view, it's some pretty good statecraft and manipulation of kind of geopolitics for him to end up in this space. Do you think is it more luck, or is he pulling all the right levers and kind of a tactical genius?
I think he is a very smart person. I mean, there have been many books written about the way Vladimir Putin thinks. I think it is fair to say he is always thinking many, many steps ahead. Clearly, he views the relationship with the United States now as it not being adversarial, but one that will potentially work with, Russia, possibly lifting sanctions on Russia. What you're seeing is the United States basically negotiating not necessarily on behalf of Ukraine, but within the Russian scope of what a victory looks like. And that is very frightening because I think that's exactly what Vladimir Putin wants. And he, Putin, we've seen him say before through, some of the folks that he puts out there and through the United States too, like Donald Trump saying like, well, Vladimir Putin wants peace. I mean, there can be peace. There literally could be peace today. I mean, Putin could withdraw all of his troops from Ukraine, but he made a calculated decision 3 years ago to invade his sovereign neighbor, and that should have consequences. And frankly, the United States should lead in those consequences.
What would your response to be? You hear this argument from kind of more America First crowd is like, we have major problems in the U.S. with drug abuse and homelessness and poverty and economic inequality. Like, how can we justify spending so much money overseas and kind of being this pillar on the world stage where we're kind of always the first one through, when, a lot of Western European countries have, depending on how you measure it, better living standards than us, higher educational attainment, longer lifespans. How would you justify that?
I think that's a great question. Something that I think also Democrats have to wrestle with on how we talk about some of these issues, because it is really important to, anyone, myself included, that gas prices are low, that I can get eggs at the supermarket, that they're not going to cost, $15, that milk prices are low. So I think that focus that, the Trump campaign and administration came in on of like wanting to focus on these economic impacts to people, that's real. And I think we need to pay attention to people feeling or not feeling like the economy is working for them. That being said, everyone wants to feel like that they are secure. I think all go about our lives pretty much with the understanding that, we are free from living from a terrorist attack, or that, we will be safe going to a movie theater, or that we will be safe going to a supermarket. That doesn't exist everywhere in the world. And it is because of American national security and our presence on the world stage that we are able to ensure, U.S. citizen security here at home. I think we need to get better about talking about that. It is in every U.S. citizen's interest that America is strong on the world stage and that we can protect the homeland, and that your interests are intertwined both economically and, militarily, all around the world. And I can go into a few examples, but go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, well, because Western European, Denmark's pretty safe and Switzerland's pretty safe, and they're kind of more withdrawn on the world stage. And you hear Donald Trump talking about this sometimes. We have these big, beautiful oceans in between us and any of our adversaries, a vast nuclear arsenal. Is there an argument to be made that Europe should be doing at least as much as the United States, or play a much more prominent role in protection of Europe and even in Ukraine? And I'm not discounting what Europe has done so far, because in many cases it's very significant. But again, U.S. is obviously taking the lead here. So how do we justify that? And do you think that Trump has a point?
Yeah, no, look, I think European countries are even acknowledging they can do more. I mean, you're seeing some of these ministers of defense at the Munich security conference that happened earlier last week, come out and say, we're in this predicament because, we're in the predicament of the administration criticizing us because we haven't done enough and contributed enough. So you are seeing some acknowledgement of that. That being said, under the Biden administration, you saw more countries contribute to NATO than ever before and raise their defense spending than we've ever seen before. You also saw the alliance grow from 30 countries to 32 countries. Yeah, sure. Europe acknowledges that it could be doing more, but also the alliance is stronger and people are contributing more. So I think we have to also acknowledge that reality that people are stepping up. And while the United States has contributed billions of dollars to Ukraine's, efforts in their war, Europe collectively has done more than the United States. So there is a pooling of resources coming together. I mean, a country like Denmark is very, size-wise is very different from the United States. Our defense industrial base is very different. I think we have to acknowledge that, but also European countries are finding ways to come together and to surge assistance to Ukraine and also surge assistance to the alliance, the defensive NATO alliance.
I want to talk a little bit about USAID because I think the criticism of that would probably come along some similar lines. Like, we have huge problems here. Why should we spend our money on other people's big problems? Make that case.
It's very simple. You can either fight an Ebola outbreak in Uganda, or you can fight it in New York City. You choose. USAID does life-saving work, but it's also work that prevents life-threatening diseases, illnesses coming to the United States. You probably remember a few years ago, we had an Ebola outbreak. Now you're seeing a bird flu outbreak. You're seeing, measles, that's also like a vaccine question, but you're seeing kind of this resurgence of some of these very deadly illnesses and diseases that the United States has inoculated against. And the way we do that is actually treat people that have them in these foreign countries so that they don't spread to our populations. USAID also is a lever in the toolbox of not just diplomacy, but of national security. When you are providing life-saving aid to people, whether it be in Sudan or, you name the country, you are creating relationships and partnerships with that country that inevitably makes our own security interests stronger. Not having an entity like USAID being able to provide this life-saving support to people, China and Russia are going to fill the void. So they're going to create these meaningful relationships with countries that the United States will not have because we have vacated them. And these countries are going to look to China and Russia to partner with them in the future. And if there was ever an attack, a global incident, we want to be able to turn to our allies and say, we need your help. And you're going to have a lot of countries that say no. And so the shutting down of USAID is totally detrimental. And I think people have to understand it's less than 1% of the budget, of the total budget that comprises USAID. And so we have to put things into perspective. There are certainly places we can cut costs. Eliminating an entire department that is, again, a lever in the diplomatic and military toolbox, you are going to make our nation less safer.
It strikes me when you were just saying that there was this refrain that I used to hear from Republicans in the war on terror. It was always like, either fight them there or you're going to fight them here. And I never really thought to apply that to disease, because that is like, it really actually fits in that paradigm perfectly, because like either you're going to fight a disease in Africa or you're going to fight it when it gets here. And you'd probably rather, for many reasons, start the work there before it gets here. And especially after, we just had COVID, the bird flu pandemic, and the scientists say that COVID wasn't even the big one. Like, the big one's coming at some point. Who knows with the infrastructure we have in place now. I think we're probably in a worse place to respond than we were before COVID. You could maybe dispute that with your previous roles, but considering what has happened, even since the President Trump took over. But yeah, no, I think that's an interesting way of thinking of it that I hadn't in the past.
And I think also there's this idea that we're spending money on people and places where that money should be invested here at home. I think there's a lot of work and a lot of money that should come back and be recouped in the economy and that U.S. citizens should have access to. But what USAID does is really about ensuring American security. And I think that's sort of what's missing. And I, I think over years, like we haven't messaged on it properly. But it's just sad to see an agency like that does such great work to not only help people, but to help American citizens as well, get dismantled in the way that it did. It's truly going to be a detriment in the long term.
It's the pulling the rug out from under people that really bothers me too. It's like if you wanted to wind down a program and you didn't think it was worth it, you wanted to invest in different places, come out and say it and pass a law and give people a little bit of time to figure out what they're going to do next. But to pull the rug out from underneath people is cruel and immoral.
Yeah.
But what do you make, the White House and Trump keep pointing out these programs that they say were being operated at USAID to, I wrote down a couple of them, DEI musical in Ireland, transgender opera in Colombia, transgender comic book in Peru. I was listening, they had a hearing over in the House where they had a former USAID administrator. I think he was under the George W. Bush administration. And he kind of said that the idea that that USAID is some racket to promote liberal social programs all over the world is insane. That's not the case. But he did make the argument, and I thought it was interesting, that by allowing these types of things to happen, you jeopardize what is such an important larger mission. I wonder, how do you think we got to a point where those type of programs were part of USAID? And does that not jeopardize these really important goals?
I think it's a good question to ask. And unfortunately, like not having been at that organization in most recently, I think, there are places that we can look at how money is spent. I don't know enough about some of the examples that you listed, and how money was being diverted to that, or if that actually is the case. Or if it's
because sometimes when you read the fine print, it's not exactly, there's like a kernel of truth in some of the things that Musk is saying, but when you look into it more deeply, it's like, well, that was part of the program that was funded, but it wasn't exactly that program actually. But
that's right. Like it's a bit of a parsing, and I think,
but to not have it just seems like you're giving them a layup. If you think this program is so important around the world, make sure that there's not an ability to criticize it. But again, I know you haven't read the fine print of it, but just your reaction to that.
They're always going to criticize, right? Like there's always going to be people of like, why are you sending bags of rice into Ethiopia when, we could have that here at home? And it's like, I think people have to remember that, like,
some of that is probably healthy to make, to hold politicians to account and make sure that, they are, a little bit of nervousness on the part of politicians that if we do anything that isn't congruent with what we think taxpayers would approve of, we could kind of get dragged for that. So I think some of that pressure is good, but
of course there's some accountability here, but like we are by nature a very interested nature. Sure, we do things out of the goodness of our heart, but that is not the purpose of USAID. USAID does good things, but it is also there to build strategic relationships. So countries like Russia and China don't do that. And it inoculates against countries from coming in, so that a government says, you know what, we would rather partner with the United States than you. In terms of how money is spent and dollars are spent on certain programs, I think it is fair to look at some of that stuff. But I think holistically, USA does such great work on behalf of the United States and for countries that they serve. I think that's what we need to focus on, and less so of like, okay, if there were 2 or 3 things that, don't align with the mission, and that's fine. Let's cut those.
Yeah. And I imagine some of that kind of oscillates back and forth between Democratic and Republican administrations, like how much leeway you'll grant these organizations to do social programs in country. You talked about this. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, Secretary Mattis actually has a great quote, and it's not word for word, but he said something like, if you cut USAID, then I'm going to need more bullets. Because they're so intertwined, the security of the United States, of our allies and partners, to how we partner with nations abroad. And so I thought that quote's always stuck with me, because he is like someone that understands that USAID, of course, has a role in whatever we do from a military side.
Yeah. You talked about this opening up, this kind of pulling back that we're seeing in U.S. foreign policy right now is opening the door for places like China and Russia. I'm especially interested in how that would look with China. I was just in Africa, actually. I was in Uganda, and it was amazing to see how many like Chinese funded projects were around. And I was talking, we had a guide that we spent a lot of time with, and we were kind of talking to him about Chinese influence in the country and how the feeling among most of the people, and I think this is probably a result of programs like USAID, is we'd rather be close to the West. We're more pro-American. But it's like the leadership and the politicians, who a lot of times they don't have a lot of control over, want to make these deals with China because there's no strings attached. And if the U.S. is pulling back, I just wonder, how do you think how will we end up seeing that? What long-term impacts are there going to be?
Well, there's always strings attached. Even if they say that there's not, there's always something.
Well, it's not human rights, and it's not kind of
right. Correct. Like when we partner with countries, we, partner with them and demand that there are certain bars that be met, like you said, human rights, etc.
Mixed track record of doing that perfectly, but yes, I mean, generally speaking, we pay attention to that much more than the Chinese. That's cool.
Yeah. Look, I think PRC is going in and saying, you need a bridge built, we'll build your bridge. You need your ports repaired, we'll do it. And, as a result, the United States is slowly getting cut off. And I think in the future can continue to get cut off from strategic access points within maybe the Indo-Pacific or, in Africa. And it is because these leaders and these governments do feel forced to sometimes turn to a partner like the PRC or Russia, because, like you said, like they're offering a deal with like no strings attached. But, they're making an investment in their country and in their people. And that is what programs like, whether it's State Department programs, USAID programs, student exchange programs, these are all like soft power programs that help deepen relationships with countries. So to get back to your question on China and its future, they're thinking very strategically about where they're making these inroads. And right now, I mean, they are getting access to a lot of minerals, a lot of mines, and that's
especially
all
in
for
Africa,
their benefit. Right? Exactly.
I remember a couple of years ago, that was kind of the huge worry on Capitol Hill and in the press, is Africa has this unprecedented access to rare earth minerals in Africa, and they've kind of secured these contracts over decades, and the U.S. is kind of left out in the cold. I don't know that there's been a strategy that's been articulated to me of like how we're going to fix that issue. And it seems like ceding this ground to China by pulling back in this way, the loss of favor that I assume we'll get with, the populace in Africa and the kind of lack of other options that many of these governments might have. These guys want to stay in power. And if they're having trouble feeding their populations or diseases spreading, they're going to be desperate to find someone that can help them.
Yeah. And when you completely abandon and renege on commitment, and the shuttering of USAID is a perfect example of that. When you shut down hospital access, when you shut down those food kitchens that people depend on, when you shut down, I mean, babies not being able to get access to their vaccines, that is of course going to stay with the population, and people are going to remember that. So, it's concerning on what this means for U.S. foreign policy in the future. I think every administration, of course, can improve our relationships with other countries all around the world. I think this administration has made it pretty clear where they stand. I don't know how much the damage can be repaired as we can continue on in these next few years.
I want to move on to another foreign policy topic because I want to make sure we talk a little bit about domestic politics and the future of the Democratic Party before I let you go. But let's talk about Gaza. We saw this gruesome scene, I guess it was yesterday, where Hamas had all these people gathered to deliver the bodies of these hostages, and where I guess there's some discrepancy of whose remains were actually given back, and a concern that could lead to an end of the ceasefire. But more broadly, do you think the two-state solution is dead? And if it is, what should be the U.S. policy moving forward?
Look, every administration has their view. I am of the mindset, and every person has their view. I am of the mindset that a two-state solution, of course, can be reached, and that is the path that makes sense and should be considered going forward. But to your question of, do you think it's possible? I think you have to remember the not just decades, but centuries worth of history in this region. And it is so complicated and complex that you can't really boil it down to today. Can this happen? You have to unpack so much of what's happened in the region. And I think if you have willing partners that are ready to work together to reach a solution and common ground, it can happen. I don't know that that is today, but I remain hopeful that in the future we could see that. But there is absolutely no question groups like Hamas cannot govern any type of space, whether it be in Gaza or elsewhere. So you have to have a legitimate government set up that's willing to not only look out for the people, but that has to work with its neighbors as well.
Yeah, I've been wondering what's going to happen with Hamas in this new development that Trump's going to build in Gaza, if they'll have residential housing there or how that problem will be handled. I guess I'm joking around a little bit, but what do you make of what Trump's been saying about his plans for the Middle East, for Gaza, for Palestine?
I don't know how developing a so-called Riviera is going to make gas prices go down, make eggs available or prices go down, make the economy stronger. So it's very contrarian because you have this person coming in and saying, I'm making America first. I'm shutting down programs we don't need, or I'm shutting down bureaus we don't need. But hold on, I'm going to build the most beautiful Riviera in a war-torn, place. And I'm somehow going to do it without putting the U.S. military at risk. And it's just going to be handed over to me. So again, I think he's the president of the United States. I'm in the full belief that we have to take his word seriously, but I have no idea what that plan looks like or how realistic it is.
Yeah, and along the same lines of this issue, you were part of the Biden administration and were watching as this issue kind of blew up in America. There were all these protests on college campuses, and I don't know how you would answer this, but can you just speak to the challenge that the Biden administration had trying to figure out, one, like what is the best way to handle this foreign policy crisis, but also two, to deal with it as a domestic political issue. And in some ways, it seems like they were pulling in different directions and ended up being damaging for Biden and probably Harris as well.
I think it's a really complex problem. And again, you're looking at the region, and what I wish people would understand is that Israel is one of our longest standing allies in the region. We are having different conversations on the world stage in different regions, to include Europe, but the United States should not walk away from its allies. And we have a strategic interest in working with Israel. And I don't think that you're going to see that change. What Hamas also did is, I mean, it's horrific. And I think that, when you saw these college protests or protests anywhere, I think people have a right to speak out and share their views and thoughts. And I think there were things that this administration, that the Biden administration that I was part of, did very well. And, we heard people, we wanted to listen to them. But, it's a very complex problem. And I think what, we struggled to explain is some of the hard conversations we were having with one of our oldest allies in the region. I mean, I was able to, hear some of those calls. It's not like we were letting anyone off the hook here, but it's hard. It's very complex, and it's of course it's going to invoke emotions from no matter where you stand. And so, I have friends in Michigan. I have friends all over the country that, saw me at the podium and would reach out to me. And, I got horrible messages. But I was also really proud of the work that our administration did in, fighting to get a deal, to get the hostages back, to get a ceasefire in place. It's a very complex problem.
What are those friends saying now? Because I haven't heard a lot from the crowd that was screaming Genocide Joe since the election. And it seems like, considering the policy changes, I don't know, we would have heard more from them.
I agree.
Let's use that to get into domestic politics and talk about, really want to talk about what you see as the path forward for the Democratic Party. But first, I'd love to hear your diagnosis of what happened in 2024. And it strikes me, you have a pretty unique view of this because you've gone against Trump 3 times. I mean, kind of not always directly, but you've been a key part of the last 3 elections that all involved Trump, some pretty high highs and some pretty low lows. What's your theory of the case for why Democrats lost in 24?
Oh, well, I'm not the expert pundit here. Look, I think it always comes down to the economy and how people feel. If you don't feel like the economy is working for you, or you don't feel that you're doing well, that of course is going to impact who you vote for. And, I think, like, we know inflation was an issue for voters. And that is something that, I think the administration took extraordinary measures to address. And you saw the economy improve, but, people just didn't feel like it was working for them. I also think Donald Trump is an incredibly disciplined messenger, and he taps into something with people, and people rally around him. And I think it's not something that, we shouldn't demonize that population for supporting him. Like, I have a lot of friends that are Trump supporters that I respect. But, we can have disagreements on policy, and he presented his platforms and people rallied around that. In terms of,
do you think it's more of, well, you mentioned that, so it seems like you're kind of saying the number one cause of Democrats losing in 2024 was the economy. I wonder, and you've heard this criticism, I'm sure, is that it was inability to, like, message and lack of communication and the ability to tell a story. Biden obviously had some limitations when it came to his ability to speak kind of off the cuff. And I just wonder what do you think about the notion that Democrats kind of lacked a excellent communicator to tell a story about what had happened and the direction they were going in a concise manner and drive that home over and over again, and that's the reason why they lost?
Again, I'm not the expert. I think that here's what I will say that I think the Trump team did very well is they were everywhere. They tried everything. They spoke to everyone from going on. I mean, I'm not just talking about like Joe Rogan. Like they were out there on platforms that, had smaller followings or that reached a different audience. And I think as a party, this is kind of an interesting time for us to recalibrate and figure out ways of how we can reach people in the different places that they consume news. I really was inspired by, I think, Kamala Harris. I think she ran, what was it, like 100 days, those few months that she had to run a campaign.
Did people see her best shot? Do you feel like, because you know her personally, right?
I thought she did a great job during it was, I mean, to run any campaign, especially a presidential, in that short of a time, what that campaign team did was incredible. But look, I mean, the messaging on the economy, people just didn't feel like the economy was working for them. And that did have a huge impact. And then, of course, Donald Trump, I think, tapped into that sentiment of like, they're not fighting for you, I'm fighting for you. And that's not the case, because I think you're seeing it now play out. But, we have to win those people back that felt like we left them.
So what do you, in your vision, is the path forward for the Democratic Party leading into the midterms and into 28? There's this kind of been this, we got to get away from the woke stuff, has been kind of like part of the mantra from what you hear in the Democratic Party and political pundits. I don't know. I guess, what do you think of that? And more broadly, is it a more Bernie Sanders style message or Bill Clinton moved to the center?
Well, I would push people to ask, like, what is this, how are we defining woke stuff? Like just using your words. I have my own ideas. Look, at the end of the day,
the excesses of the progressive left social justice move.
Look, I think those issues are important. We can't just like forget that this administration is rolling back, women's access, my access to reproductive health care. Like that's important, and we should talk about that. But I think we have to remember also that we can't completely forget about talking about the other issues and the issues that resonate with people. And those are the economic issues, and tying them together. I think there's a way to do that. Again, not the pollster here, not the message, haven't done enough focus or test groups to test this out, but like, can we tie some of those messages that are super important to the party and turn it around into an economic frame that makes sense? Because like me being able to access the things that I need on a day-to-day basis makes me more comfortable in my work, makes me a better, productive person overall, will make me spend money in the economy, and that just kind of feeds it back. But, we do have some work to do on gaining folks back into the party. And we have 2 years to do it with the midterms, and then we got 4 years to do it with the presidency. And I think we have to start just making our case now.
Do you think Kamala Harris can or should get back into presidential politics? And what about the other California politician that everyone talks about, Gavin Newsom? What do you make of him and the possibility that he could be a presidential candidate?
I think there are such amazing candidates in our party, from Harris to Newsom to you name it. We have a lot of talent in this party. And so whoever runs, I think they're going to go through I did the 2020 primary, so I can tell you primaries are generally not that fun, but it's a good way to test the best one to emerge. And I think, even though there's criticism about the party, people should get excited. I mean, we have some really good talent out there. And I think, whoever it is, all of these candidates that decide to run are going to have to make their case. And that's going to be really exciting to watch.
You seem pretty optimistic about the future of the Democratic Party and maybe the possibility for the U.S. in general. That's not what I hear a lot from Democrats in Washington in these days. Do you feel that? Do you hear that a lot? And how do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, I don't think we have a choice but to be optimistic. I mean, I could go upstairs and scream into my pillow and, try and bury my head in the sand or whatever analogy you want to use here. I'm using poor ones, but I think we have to try. I think we have to, of course, I've heard the criticisms like, who's the party leader, who's going to emerge. First of all, it has literally been a month, since Donald Trump has been in office. We're going to have we already have exciting voices, and you're going to see new ones emerge. And I think we have to be optimistic about it, because if we're not, and if we don't try and win people back to our side and make the case for why they should support us, well, then we're just setting ourselves up for another 4 years of just absolute hell. So, I don't think that's, maybe I'm optimistic, or maybe I'm a realist that thinks that we have a lot of talent out there, and I'm excited to see, what comes of that.
All right. I just have one more question for you before I let you go. I saw in a recent interview where you were asked about the existence of aliens, and you were pretty short with your answer, and you just said no. Does that come from a basis in knowledge of the extent of U.S. Knowledge of aliens, or were you just spitballing there? Do you have any news you want to break on the World and Stuff podcast?
Well, Drew, I don't know if you know this, but Independence Day wasn't a fictional movie. It was a documentary.
Great movie.
There's a lot of, a lot of interesting things that I've been asked before, especially at the podium. That one certainly is always a fun one to get. I feel confident in saying that there are not aliens that I am aware of. But,
all right. I mean,
maybe
I did watch
something that I don't know.
There's a documentary on Amazon Prime, and I walked away from watching that saying, well, there's aliens. But
I think if you are looking at, when we had all these incursions of drones in our airspace, I think you got to turn to your neighbor and be like, do you have a drone? And do you fly it at night? Or are you standing outside an airport and watching planes land at night? Look, there are.
Don't jump to the conclusion that it's an alien every time you see a light in the sky. Is that what you're saying?
Great advice.
All right. I know you got to go. I appreciate you so much for taking the time to chat. It was an interesting conversation, and I wish you the best in whatever you decide to do next. And maybe we'll have you on again in the future. That'd be great.
I'd love to. Thanks for having me on today.